This archaeological site from the late Bronze Age represents a city of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And we can talk about how people were organized at a scale of hundreds or thousands of square kilometers, as well as at smaller scales.
How can the mapping of ancient surface artifacts and refuse help reconstruct the structure of the earliest proto-states? Why is American football a better analogy for early complex societies than basketball? And why can inequalities in authority sometimes matter more than inequalities in wealth? Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail Rodin, and welcome to the Frontiers of Historical Research. Today we will discuss this question with Dr. Robert Drennan.
I've always worked on the archaeology of very early complex societies. I started doing that in doing fieldwork related to that in Mexico as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, where I got my doctoral degree, and continued working in Mexico for a while on what are sometimes called chiefdoms, the earliest complex societies, and then began fieldwork in Colombia because its sequence of chiefdom development is a very long one. In places like Mexico, really large scale, complex states and very large populations developed very quickly after settled agricultural life and the beginnings of complex societies. And so we don't have a very long time period of the early stages of this major human transformation to study. And the really large populations of later periods make it hard to study them archaeologically because it makes the remains hard to find. And so my career turned towards places where there are longer periods of relatively small scale and early stage complex societies, with work in Colombia and the Alto Magdalena, in collaboration with colleagues at especially the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia and other Colombian universities. And following a long period of work in Colombia, I also have worked on the same kinds of issues in China, in the Northeast, where likewise there's a pretty long period of beginnings of settled agricultural life and integration of somewhat larger but not vastly larger populations into complex societies. And so those interests have gone through my career from the beginning, and have sort of directed me toward a sequence of three countries where I've spent a lot of time doing fieldwork, especially, and also collaborated with people in fieldwork in other parts of the world too.
How does the study of early complex societies fit into the intellectual context of North American archaeology?
Yeah, there are a lot of things to say about that. One is to recognize right at the outset that the kinds of interests that archaeologists have are enormously varied. And archaeologists who work in different parts of the world, that is, do research on different parts of the world, and archaeologists who are trained and live and do their job, do their work, are in universities in different parts of the world, have developed this remarkably diverse set of traditions about what archaeology is all about, what we're interested in archaeology. And just to be quite clear, the kind of archaeology that has always most interested me is a social scientific kind of archaeology, a kind of archaeology that asks questions about how human societies work. How do we understand better the forces that shape human societies give them the forms of organization that they have, uh, and that drive change in human social organization, political organization, economic organization. There are a lot of archaeologists just doing fascinating things who are not at all interested in those kinds of questions. Um, they're interested in very directly and overwhelmingly in material culture and the art and artifacts that people have produced, and that's not an unrelated interest, but it's a very different kind of focus. Um, and an anthropological or social scientific focus has historically been especially strong in the Americas because of the strong links between archaeology and anthropology, cultural anthropology or ethnology in the Americas. In Europe and Asia, archaeologists are, to a very large extent, studying their own ancestors who lived in the places where they teach in universities and work in museums today. Um, in the Americas, the intellectual history of archaeology is very different. And archaeologists primarily were from a European colonizing population studying an indigenous American population of ancient times. Um, and well, cultural anthropologists also were largely from a colonizing European population studying an indigenous American population. So there's a natural kind of link between people studying indigenous Americans in the present and in the past that forged this link between archaeology and cultural anthropology in the Americas. And the links between archaeology and other disciplines in Europe and Asia have been more with history, their own history. Whereas archaeologists and cultural anthropologists in the Americas are mostly studying indigenous America. And so it's a very different kind of context in which to study people in modern or ancient times. And so anthropological archaeology, a social scientific kind of archaeology, developed with a lot of vigor in the Americas in a somewhat different way than academic archaeology did in Europe or Asia. And the kinds of interests that I have grow to a large extent out of that very different intellectual history behind the archaeology that I particularly grew up knowing and was attracted to because of intellectual curiosity. It's curiosity about how human societies work and what forces shape them and drive change in them that finally pulled me most strongly into archaeology. And so that's for me, those earliest stages of complex societies are especially interesting because a lot of features of the sorts of societies most of the world's population lives in today appeared and developed. Strong differentiation of various kinds, that is, different kinds of roles and relationships that were structural in human societies. That structure was beginning to be built in a very vigorous way in most parts of the world soon after settled agricultural life was established. In some places, agriculture was not such a big part of it. And in some places, even a higher degree of mobility permitted these kinds of social developments. But in many, many cases, it comes soon after the establishment of sedentary life based on domesticated plant and animal raising. And at a varying pace in different parts of the world, but sometimes very quickly, human societies began to get much larger demographically. Their populations began to grow. The numbers of people who were integrated politically into single societies increased sharply, and the complexity and variety of social relationships and interaction increased really strongly. And it's the beginnings of those changes that then continued on after the periods that I've mostly focused on, to yet larger scale and more complex societies. But it's the beginnings of establishing those patterns that have always interested me most.
Is it fair to say that archaeology can trace such developments almost anywhere, and that your interest in the early stages of social complexity is a universal scientific question?
It is certainly the the interest in understanding how human societies work and what forces shape them is a really, really super broad social science question. It has utility in the present world because we have to manage our own societies. We have to be able to understand if we do this, if we institute this kind of policy, what sort of impact can we expect it to have? How can we expect it to change our societies? And while archaeology doesn't have pat solutions to all the world's problems today, it can contribute to a really fundamental understanding of how human societies work that's of practical import, as well as satisfying a fundamental intellectual curiosity about how human societies work. And these initial steps towards the kind of really large and complex nation states that almost all of us live in today um, were being taken all over the world on all continents. And they, in different regions, they followed different courses. There are hundreds and hundreds of regions around the world where those initial steps towards much more complex, larger scale societies were taken. And it's a wonderful set of natural experiments because we can see what happened in different sorts of conditions around the world and what forces were at play here and there and elsewhere, and what different effects they had in different places, and try to establish patterns of relationships and all that variation, relationships between forces at work and social outcomes that help us understand us as ourselves as a species better.
How can we as scientists make this knowledge publicly available, and can it be used by policymakers in decision making?
It's difficult everywhere to make people understand um, how social sciences generally can contribute to making our lives better, and making the world a better place. Because social scientists, maybe most especially not archaeologists, don't have easy solutions to the problems of the modern world. I think what social science, some economists, political scientists are working with specific issues in the modern world that are much more directly related to the problems of the modern world and how to solve them. How to provide a better life for people who are poor, are practical problems that economists and political scientists work on in the modern world context. Archaeologists are much more removed from that. And it's easy to make it seem like it's easy to oversimplify and make it seem like there's simple lessons to be learned from the past. They're not simple. There are lessons to be learned from the past, but they're not simple. Um, and I think the best way archaeology can contribute is probably not through sort of the direct implications of the findings of some archaeological project, but by broad long-term thinking about how looking at change across hundreds and thousands of years can help sort of help us understand really fundamental principles better, that from which practical actions in the modern world can in part be derived. Um, Going and studying an ancient society that seems like it had some problems like ours and learning how they were solved successfully or not with direct application to our own societies is probably too simple a way to look at it. Um, but we can see how to take a modern preoccupation with inequality in a lot of countries. There are a lot of parts of the world where politicians and people are greatly vexed by dramatically increasing economic inequality and the impact that that has on people's lives. And so there are a fair number of people working in a variety of places trying to figure out how to diminish inequality and make the distribution of economic resources more equitable and fair. And it can contribute to those efforts if we understand better how it is, what are the forces that made modern human societies so often so unequal. Where did that come from? What's that all about? Why haven't we had societies for the last few thousand years that were much more egalitarian? Just what forces push inequality to become stronger and stronger and stronger? What forces tend to work against emerging inequalities? And if we look at that over the course of centuries or even millennia in early complex societies, we can understand fundamental principles of how this works and what produces change of what kinds that we can hope will help us in managing our own societies towards taking the shapes that we would like them to have.
What has shaped economic and social inequality in human societies, such as Mexico?
It obviously follows from what we've just been talking about that there's not a simple answer to that question. It's a big, complicated question, and to take Mexico in particular, there's a certain amount of debate going on at present about the extent of inequalities, and their connections to political systems. A relatively recent kind of revisionist thread is that some of the societies of ancient Mexico were more egalitarian than archaeologists have thought they were. Some of us are not entirely persuaded by the evidence behind that. And that has set a lot of us back to look more deeply at how we can reconstruct our inequalities from archaeological evidence. And one of the things that I think that has led to a recognition of, that I think is important, is that there are a lot of dimensions to inequality. And when we talk about inequality in the modern world, this is a conversation that mostly goes on among economists. And so what we're thinking of is differences in wealth and income, material resources. If we look at the earliest complex societies, we find that some of the big differences in the pathways of development that they were following have to do with which kinds of inequalities were strongly developed, and that inequality can productively be considered in a sort of broader context as a particular kind of differentiation. And so, one of the big trends in early complex societies is that social roles were becoming more differentiated. That goes for wealth differentiation. Some people were becoming much richer than other people. Those economic differences were widening out as early complex societies emerged. And those economic differences became really strong in some societies. In many societies, prehistoric societies in Mexico, many ancient societies in Mexico, that wealth differentiation was very strong. There are a few in Mexico, more in some other parts of the world, where wealth differentiation of that sort, wealthy inequality, was not very elaborately developed, but that doesn't mean they were egalitarian. One kind of inequality that was sometimes strongly developed was prestige inequality, not as in contrast to wealth inequality. And this goes back to a social science distinction emphasized, for example, by Max Weber more than 100 years ago. There's a difference between social prestige and wealth. Some people are extremely wealthy, but Elon Musk, for example, cannot readily be said to have a lot of social prestige. In fact, he's really widely criticized and thought ill of by many people. The social prestige that's the connection between social prestige and wealth is not automatic. Sometimes wealthy people can be prestigious and have social prestige, but it's not automatic. People can also be socially prestigious, but not wealthy. We think of this in modern societies pretty easily in terms of occupations. Some occupations are prestigious. They bring you social prestige. A university professor, in many contexts anyway, earns a certain amount of respect for doing something valuable and worthwhile. But university professors, I can tell you firsthand, are not extremely highly paid. They're not generally wealthy people. Social prestige, respect, and wealth or income are two different things that are related in complicated ways. And those complicated kinds of relationships and the difference between respect, social prestige on the one hand, and economic or wealth differentiation on the other hand, put some very early complex societies on very different courses of development. And understanding what are the circumstances that gave rise to moving along these different pathways, helps us understand this dynamic of complicated relationships between wealth and prestige. Ritual differentiation is another really important thing in early complex societies, much more strongly developed in some than in others, and this helps us to understand what forces accelerate its development. Another issue that we talk about in complex societies a lot is what I like to refer to as productive differentiation. It's more often called craft specialization. But productive differentiation is a somewhat broader thought that recognizes that people can dedicate themselves to different productive activities and produce goods that other people consume. And this intensifies economic interaction of a particular sort. And it's yet another kind of differentiation that develops very strongly in some early complex societies. Okay, productive differentiation and wealth differentiation are especially strongly developed in some societies, and many of those societies are especially abundant among the early complex societies of Mexico. Further south, in Central America and Northern South America, it's much more common to find societies in which prestige and ritual differentiation are really strong, and productive and wealth differentiation are not as strongly developed. This is not like a Mexican pattern against a Central American or Northern South American pattern, because there are exceptions in both those parts of the world. And that enables us to dig into the forces that are really at work, producing these kinds of differentiation and strengthening them. And that finally ought to give us some understanding of fundamental principles that will be useful to us in creating societies today that have the kind of shape we'd like them to have.
Why are the societies we are talking about called complex?
What makes them complex is the diversity and the degree of difference between larger numbers of different social roles and structured relationships. In the foraging societies that our ancestors had lived in for a long, long time before what we customarily label as complex societies. It's not that those societies lacked complexity in some sense, or were very, very simple. They were very complicated too. Um, but in the much smaller scale foraging societies that preceded what we often label complex societies, it's a simplistic label. But in the foraging societies that preceded them, the demographic scale was much smaller. And that simply, and there were fewer different social roles and structured kinds of relationships. It's not that everybody was just like everybody else, but there were fewer differences between people of a variety of kinds. And part of that is demographic. You can simply play much more complicated or complex games with more people than you can with fewer people. And I would usually rather use almost any kind of analogy than sports analogies, but I think there's a good one here. American football and basketball are two very different kinds of game. And there are demographic connections. Basketball teams have 5 people. Football teams have 11. You can even play a very good game of one-on-one basketball with just 2 people. You can't do that with American football. The game cannot be played with only 2 or 3 people on each team. And human social complexity is a little bit like that. If there are to be the kind of increase in the differentiated roles and relationships of people, football has more different kinds of roles and relationships than basketball does. Basketball is more fluid and flexible. Relationships are less structured in less complicated ways. And with more people, one of the things that can happen, at least, is more differentiation, more different roles, more variety of structured relationships, bigger differences. That's the core of the complexity that we talk about in complex society, in that particular sense. American football is a more complicated game than basketball. It has more variety of roles and structured relationships among players.
And probably more rigid.
And more rigidity to the structure, because those roles and relationships excuse me, those roles and relationships get rules about them.
By demographics, people often understand the age and sex characteristics of a given society based on burial data. How can we discern complex social relationships and social roles in archaeological sources?
It's certainly true that demography includes an awful lot of aspects about people in human societies, or non-human societies, for that matter, as well, non-human groups. Applies to other species. But it certainly includes the age and sex structure of a population. It also includes the gross size of a population and its spatial distribution, its patterns of growth and decline in overall numbers are also parts of demography. And all of those things have intimate connection to social, political, and economic organization. We're concerned in the modern world about growing populations and shrinking populations, because that has implications for the size of the labor force that's producing the goods and services that people need to live on. It impacts their well-being. Populations that are shrinking often have very, very large proportions of older people who may be past the highly productive stage of their life, and everybody is dependent for goods and services, not on small children and very old people, but on people in their most productive years. And if those balances, that age structure doesn't include enough people in their highly productive years, but a lot of people who are very young or a lot of people who are very old, that has an immediate and direct impact on economic well-being. It has implications for social and political structure and organization. And so all of these aspects of demography are interconnected, and they all have implications for the kinds of issues of social organization that I've talked about. So it's important for us to try to learn about demography in ancient times if we want to understand human societies well. It's one of the important factors. This has been much misunderstood in archaeology, and archaeologists who have been interested in trying to reconstruct demography have sometimes been thought to argue that population growth causes all social change. And while some people have indeed argued that, this is not true. It's not accurate to say that this is where demographic studies lead you at archaeology. The relationships are complicated and subtle and sophisticated. It takes a lot of study to figure out how these different parts of human societies are connected to each other and to demography. But there are connections. Economists, sociologists, political scientists recognize that in the modern world there are strong implications of demographic change for human social, political, and economic change. There's no reason to think that wasn't true in the past as well. And one of the advantages of studying early complex societies is that maybe they're not quite as complicated as the modern nation states having millions or hundreds of millions of people today. Maybe we can understand some fundamental principles more readily if we look at them in a somewhat less complex situation at the beginnings of things. So, you asked about how we do this archaeologically. We need to do something like the fundamental data collection tasks that modern social scientists do in studying demography. Censuses. That's where our demographic data come from today. Practically every nation in the world conducts a regular census of some kind, and it does a lot more than just count people. It counts how many people, most fundamentally, are where. It studies how their distribution changes through time. It also studies what they do for a living and all kinds of other aspects of people's lives. Collects data about this and how it changes through time. If archaeologists want to do this, we can't go around and with a clipboard and ask people how many people live in this house and who does what for a living and supports the household and how old is everybody and so on and so forth. We have to do it much more indirectly from material remains. And I would say at this point, there are probably, well, there are a lot of different aspects to it. One that I think is particularly important is what we call systematic regional survey. And basically, what that is a systematic collection of data across every patch of a defined landscape within a territory. We do that by looking for the material remains that people lived there in the distant or more recent past. More than anything else, those are the preservable remains of garbage. Wherever people live, we leave garbage on the landscape. Some of that garbage disappears. It's not well preserved, it rots away, it just disappears without a trace. But some elements of the garbage persist for really long periods of time. Um, Metal tools and other kinds of artifacts can persist for a fairly long period of time. But even longer and better preserved are two kinds of material: lithic tools, stone tools, and ceramics are both really resistant to decay. And if people are making and using stone tools, which we have been doing for over 1 million years, or if people are making and using ceramics, which we've been doing for probably up to 10,000 years in some places, um, those two elements don't decay away. They last for an incredibly long time. Both are useful, especially ceramics are useful because styles change in ceramics, just like clothing styles change. For no necessarily particularly good reason, what I'm wearing right now will look old-fashioned and out of style, certainly in 25 years, maybe in 10, maybe in 5. Ceramics don't always change quite that fast, but styles just do change, and we can learn to recognize them. So, archaeologists can walk around on the landscape and find ceramics on the surface of the ground that were thrown away as garbage thousands of years ago. Often, with enough study, we can learn to just look at the ceramics and tell roughly how long ago. That means we can organize a large project to look at tens or hundreds of thousands of square kilometers and systematically map where we find garbage of what date. The more garbage we find in a particular place from a particular period, the more people were there throwing away garbage. That's the key link to demography. The more garbage we find in a place from a particular period, the more people were living there. And so, in a series of logical links, we can make maps of where there's a lot of garbage, where the garbage from when is deposited, and what that distribution looks like in time, and how it changes across time. And with those maps and enough work at firmly establishing the connecting links, we can make approximations of how many people that represents. It enables us to say not just there was an archaeological site here where people lived in the late Bronze Age, but enables us to say this archaeological site from the late Bronze Age represents maybe a village of 100 or 150 people, or represents a town of 10 or 20,000 people, or represents a city of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. The remains of those three kinds of settlement are very different, particularly in regard to the area they cover and the density of remains. And we can talk about how people were organized at a scale of hundreds or thousands of square kilometers, as well as at smaller scales. The spatial distribution of people has a lot to do with their interaction and the way that interaction was structured. And so this kind of study of archaeological remains, that study of the preservable elements of garbage and how it's distributed through time and through space, are the keys to reconstructing changing patterns of organization by way of demography.
How does demographic information from secondary sources help us understand social complexity and diversity in the past?
One really central element in the emergence of early complex societies is the creation of regional scale political integration with political leaders and welding people together into a genuine polity that has a kind of organization that hadn't existed on that kind of scale before. We can see those emerging because they very often, not always, but very often, everything that we say about these kinds of subjects is a tendency, not a hard and fast rule. But these societies have a really strong tendency to be focused around a central place of some sort. In those central places, political leaders live and work. It's from those central places that the leadership that welds them together into regional polities, that leadership is exercised. It involves a good little bit of interaction between people, between leaders, their agents, and eventually the people who are led in a hierarchical way. That the degree of hierarchy can vary. It can be more cooperative or it can be more autocratic. But some degree of centralization for organization and for leadership is a really strong tendency in such societies. More frequent and intensive interaction is subject to distance interaction principles. It's easier to have more intensive and more frequent interactions at shorter distances. This is true even with the kinds of communication and transportation technologies that we have now. It certainly was when the only way to speak to someone was to walk to where that person is and talk to that person. The more interaction people had with leaders in a center and whatever activities were going on in a center of an emerging polity, the more advantageous it was not to live too far away from that center, so as to spend less of your time walking back and forth to do the things that you had to do in the way of interacting with the people who were at that center. This creates sort of centripetal forces drawing people towards the center. These didn't exist before early complex societies emerged, as hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of people were integrated into a regional polity. We can see on the landscape in the remains of their garbage, as more and more people were drawn closer and closer towards a demographic center of gravity, with more sparsely populated buffer zones in the direction of a neighboring polity where people were also drawn towards its center, and human population distribution formed very recognizable clusters. Those clusters get more intense as centralization becomes stronger in growing polities, and the amount of garbage deposited on the landscape increases as more people populate those polities. And so we can monitor the emergence of those early complex political organizations, early complex polities, by looking at how people's distribution across space changes through time, as reflected in the amount of garbage deposited where and when.
How does your work in the Upper Magdalena River region of Colombia illustrate the processes described?
Yeah, there were several things that surprised me about what we began to find as we worked on these kinds of issues in the Alto Magdalena in southwestern Colombia. when I did my graduate training in Mexico and continued to do research in Mexico for some years thereafter. I was used to working on really clearly defined archaeological sites that were the remains of relatively compact villages where neighbors lived fairly close together, 20, 30, 40 meters from another house. Not super compact, but relatively compact. And in an area of 2 or 3 hectares, there might be 15 or 30 houses, that many nuclear families living where people interacted fairly closely. Every morning when you went out the door of your house, you saw your neighbors going out the doors of their houses. They were that close. And between these villages were open spaces where people didn't live. They farmed, they hunted, they used that landscape in a variety of ways, but people lived in pretty compact, separated villages. And in those villages, productive differentiation or craft specialization developed pretty quickly and pretty strongly. It was easy to decide that you were really good at making stone tools for cutting and focus on that and exchange some of them with your neighbors who were only just right over there for corn and do less work in the fields raising corn because you would rather sit at home and work on making chipstone tools. Simple preferences and basic talents like that of different people could play out into more complicated and structured kinds of economic relationships in the context of very intensive daily interaction with your neighbors in those compact villages. And well, we just thought that's what villages were like. As agricultural villages began to develop in lots and lots of regions around the world early on, but we came to realize in the Alto Magdalena that it was really hard to define archaeological sites. We could hardly go anywhere on the landscape where we didn't find the remains of ceramics. People were living everywhere. But it also became apparent that while we found ceramics practically everywhere, they were at very, very low densities compared to the densities within archaeological sites in Mesoamerica for the most part. And that meant that while people were living almost everywhere, they weren't living at high densities. At any given moment, their neighbors were not very close to each other. Their neighbors might be a house 100 meters over that way and another one 300 meters down there. Maybe mostly out of sight. They didn't live in relatively compact villages where their neighbors were 10 or 20 or 30 meters away. They lived in a very different pattern. Everybody lived on the land that they farmed. And over time, it got to be that practically every place that was livable had been lived on at some point by at least a few people, but seldom very many. And that was a very different pattern of local living that we had not thought about very much. We thought about villages with close neighbors, but early sedentary agricultural living where people were very scattered across the landscape, each one on its own little farm, was not very much part of our consciousness. And we would not have recognized this about the Alta Magdalena unless we had systematically gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth across the entire landscape, mapping out how much pottery of each period we found in every place across the landscape. we finally decided that talking about archaeological sites didn't make any sense at all, because it would just be an arbitrary carving up of a scattered farmstead distribution. It's a different way to live. It has different interaction implications. You have much less interaction, much less intensive interaction with a smaller number of people, because people are just much more scattered out. And so you tend to interact more strongly with people you live closer to on average. Sure, there are going to be some people you don't like and you don't interact with them much, even though they may live nearby, although fighting with them is a form of interaction. But interaction takes on a different character in very scattered farmsteads than it does in compact settlements, compact local communities. And we became much more aware of that as as one of the pathways that early complex societies can follow in sedentary agricultural living. And among the implications that seem to go with that is that when complex societies develop, become more differentiated and more unequal in patterns of very scattered farmstead living, that different ritual differentiation and prestige differentiation are likely to become very strong, much stronger than wealth differentiation and productive differentiation. Productive differentiation requires a lot more intensive and frequent interaction between producers and consumers. And productive differentiation can be a strong basis of accumulating wealth. And so those two kinds of differentiation have a tendency to develop especially and strongly in relatively compact communities, not without exception by any means. And prestige and ritual differentiation develop more readily than wealth and productive differentiation do in scattered farmstead living, because prestige and ritual differentiation do not depend on such intensive and frequent interaction with neighbors.
How can we understand whether inequality in personal authority was more developed in a particular society based on archaeological evidence?
It involves several kinds of evidence. One of them is very related to the kinds of demographic evidence we've talked about on a regional scale, but on a local scale. We can also look at the distribution of different kinds of artifacts within a local community. Sometimes this can be done by collecting artifacts on the surface. Sometimes it requires a particular kind of excavation, sampling the several hectares of a local community. It can't be done with even a big excavation of 20 meters by 20 meters. That's a big excavation for most parts of the world. But that's really only kind of a household or two or three, even in a pretty compact community. What we need to do is sample artifacts across the perhaps several hectares of a local community, and we can find out more about how households were differentiated within that local community. If there's a lot of productive differentiation, well, you'll find that some households have a lot of lithic debitage, the waste products, the scrap stone flakes from making cutting tools out of stone, and other households don't have very much. You'll find that some households have an awful lot of evidence of agricultural tools and food processing tools, and others lower proportions of those kinds of artifacts. You'll find that some households have a higher proportion of ceramic making tools and the broken and distorted ceramics that are damaged in the process of firing. If there's a lot of productive differentiation, those kinds of evidence of production of different kinds will be highly concentrated in certain households. If there's not much productive differentiation, all households will have about the same proportions of all of those things. What we find in the Alta Magdalena is that all households have about the same proportions of those kinds of things. there wasn't much productive differentiation. We can study wealth differentiation in the same way. If some households have higher standards of living than others, they'll have more costly and nicer possessions that will break and wear out and wind up in the garbage. If we find that all households have about the same proportions of really nice, costly things, then there wasn't much wealth differentiation. If we find that some households have much higher proportions than others of costly and fine and fancy things, then there was more wealth differentiation. That's complemented by evidence of the kinds of houses that people lived in, were some of them larger and nicer and better constructed and more comfortable than others. That means that we need to know what a lot of houses were like, not just a few, but a lot. And that differences of that kind are also indicative of wealth differentiation. It goes with burial practices as well, in which if there's a lot of wealth differentiation, there may also be quite a lot of difference in the material investment in burials, offerings included with the structures that the dead are placed in. And particularly burials may or may not be strongly connected with ritual activities of certain kinds. In the Alta Magdalena, some burials are extremely elaborate. They're large stone slab structures covered with earthen mounds and surrounded by monumental scale stone statues. The stone statues particularly have iconography that suggests shamanism and ritual themes, their combination of human and animal characteristics and other iconographic elements that suggest that these burials that were large slab tombs under earthen mounds were places of ritual, probably for generations thereafter. Only a few people could be buried that way. Most people didn't get that kind of burial treatment. They got much simpler burial treatment. But there's a really important distinction that archaeologists have not usually paid a lot of attention to. Burials can be elaborate and costly in a variety of ways. We're most accustomed to thinking of really rich burials. They have gold and bronze and elaborate, expensive ornamental and artifacts and weaponry, and they just reek of wealthy people. The ones in the Alta Magdalena are not like that. They have a lot of elaboration in terms of architecture of tombs and sculpture and religious iconography. But the offerings placed with the dead are quite meager. They're not hundreds of ceramic vessels and gold. In Colombia, ancient goldwork discovering ancient goldwork is an economical, a practical mining strategy. And large numbers of people today in Colombia, or at least a substantial number of people in Colombia today, earn their living by looting ancient archaeological sites because there's gold in them. Not so much in the Alta Magdalena. It's different from other places in Colombia in this regard. The tombs are much more elaborate architecturally and sculpturally, but they have some goldwork and some sort of objects placed with the dead that suggest that those dead were wealthy. A few things connected to the economic well-being. But it seems like the people buried in those really elaborate tombs were there more because they were prestigious, because they were highly respected on account of their religious and ritual roles that are expressed in statuary. And so it leads us, these are some of the kinds of archaeological evidence that point us towards strong ritual differentiation, strong prestige differentiation, but very weak wealth differentiation and very weak productive differentiation in the societies of the Alta Magdalena. And they differ in this regard from societies elsewhere in Colombia and in other parts of the world. And we can study societies in any part of the world in terms of these dimensions and say which ones were strongly developed along the pathway that this society followed through hundreds or thousands of years, and which ones were weakly developed. And we can ask ourselves, what were the forces that pushed this society along this pathway and this other one in some other place along that pathway?
Returning to the beginning of our conversation about the role of archaeology in modern society, can you tell us about how your work in Colombia developed against the backdrop of the acute phase of the civil war in that country?
I don't know how much archaeological work has really contributed to greater well-being and peace in Colombia. Um, but certainly the kind of research that we've been talking about, regional settlement survey. I don't think it's a term that we've used so far in the conversation, but this is what the fieldwork process of collecting the kind of demographic data we've talked about is. Um, of necessity brings you into contact with lots and lots of people who live in a region because you're going across the entire landscape, and people in the Alta Magdalena today and in much of Colombia live on scattered farmsteads, the way people in ancient times in this region did. There are also compact settlements today that didn't exist at a lot of times in the past in a lot of parts of Colombia. Um, but you go from farmstead to farmstead and you talk to people and you ask them for permission to come into their farm fields and look around and see if you find ceramics and make collections of some of it to take back to the lab and clean up and study. And that leads to lots and lots of conversations about what the heck you're doing there, and why, and what good is it anyway? To some people, it seems like it answers a really kind of understandable intellectual curiosity, and for others, it's much more a question of what good is this? Um, does it really do anything productive in the modern world? And I think it puts the archaeologist in a context that's really healthy to continually explain to people who are not doing archaeology, um, what archaeology is about, why it's a good thing for modern societies to support archaeological research, and the outcomes of those conversations about what archaeology is about and what it might contribute to the modern world are highly varied. Sometimes they're just an utter flop. I can remember a conversation in particular in Mexico with some farmers, and we were trying to explain to them why we were there, what we were doing, and that we were figuring out. In part, we had begun to learn that people lived sort of on the lower slopes of the Piedmont, slope coming down to the valley floor, um, and that this was adjacent to the fertile land, and yet up out of the swamp and the mud that we were wading around in at the moment this conversation took place, discovering that people didn't live there in the ancient past very much. Um, and the reaction of the farmers we were talking to at that point was kind of, well, duh, we know that. Look where our village is up there on the lower slopes. They're out of this mud and stuff, and it seemed like we were going to an awful lot of hard work and trouble to find out something patently obvious to these farmers. Um, and other times it's more successful, and one of the more successful conversations that I had about this was in Colombia, with an extremely large patrol of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, um, a guerrilla group fighting for equality and economic well-being for the poor of Colombia. Still in the period when those ideals were really pretty strongly held in the FARC, and they were one of the major parties in an ongoing civil war that lasted for a very, very long time in Colombia, and in many senses is not over yet. Um, and a group of students from Colombian and American universities uh, and I were there trying to explain to them what we were doing there, um, and and in pretty high stakes for convincing them that what we were doing was worthwhile and not something that ought to be stamped out because they were extremely well armed. Um, and after a really lengthy conversation, I'm wondering how this would come out and just when we would leave. Um, the commander of this FARC fighting group um, actually produced the biggest success I've had, I think, ever in trying to explain what archaeology is about and how it can contribute to the modern world. After this long, what closed this long conversation, and in fact was when the commander said, "Ah, veo, es saber de dónde venimos para entender hacia dónde vamos." Ah, I see. It's know where we came from so we can understand where we're going. And that really sums it up for me.